So hello everyone, I'm Adrian Martin.
Hi, I'm Tammy Mills.
And our webinar today is on writing a successful proposal for the self-study of teacher education practices special interest group, which is part of the American Educational Research Association. Tammy and I are currently serving as the program co-chairs for the self-study SIG this academic year, and we are preparing for next year's annual meeting to be held in Orlando. And we just like to start off by welcoming everyone. We hope everybody is keeping safe, healthy, and doing well during these challenging times. When Tammy and I initially sent out the invitation for this webinar, we really were unsure what the response would be, and we were really pleased and quite enthused at the high number of folks from around the world, teacher educators, scholars, doctoral students that responded and were really enthusiastic and interested in joining us. So we have individuals from all around the globe that expressed interest. So we're glad you're here and look forward to spending this time together. Our aim with this session is to shed some light on and offer some insight on the proposal process for writing proposals for the AERA annual meeting. When we submitted the invitation for this session, there were some questions everyone was asked to respond to, and the overwhelming majority of respondents indicated that they had not previously submitted to AERA or had not previously submitted to the self-study SIG. So what we're going to focus on in this session is really taking a closer look at the different components, the different elements for a proposal that are required by AERA, and really kind of take a deep dive into those, go over them, review them, have a discussion on these, go over some frequently asked questions and some common errors or mistakes that authors make when they submit proposals for consideration in the annual meeting. And while our discussion's going to be general enough to address those common areas for proposals required by AERA, we are going to call special attention to and give particular consideration when submitting a proposal for the self-study SIG. We'll also make a note, we are recording this session, so it should be available to view after the session is over, and this way it'll also be accessible to others who cannot join us in real time. So we'll go through these aspects of the proposal process, and we'll have some time to answer questions you may have. Please feel free to use the chat feature, the chat box, to share your questions. We're scheduled for about an hour. We can stay a little longer to try to answer as many questions as we can. But if there's something that we didn't answer that wasn't attended to in the webinar, our contact information will be provided at the end, and you're certainly welcome to reach out to us and communicate with us. So we'll move forward, and a little bit about us. So as I said, I'm Adrian Martin. I am currently an assistant professor in the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education at New Jersey City University. I have been part of the self-study community for quite some time. I was introduced to self-study as a doctoral student, and self-study is a primary strand in my research agenda. I am particularly interested in equity and social justice issues in schools, relevant to teaching diverse students, and thinking about how teacher education and teacher preparation can support more inclusive schools for all students.
Hi, I'm Tammy Mills. I'm also an assistant professor at the University of Maine. I in curriculum assessment and instruction with a focus on teacher education. I too was introduced to self-study at Montclair State University, where I finished my PhD. So I've worked with Adrian for quite a while. And I am interested in not only self-study, but 28 years of classroom experience has also taught me the importance of the boundaries between personal and professional selves. So really understanding that and using self-study to interrogate those boundaries. I work in rural teacher ed, being in Maine, and issues that surround rural teacher education and kind of dynamic conceptions of identity rather than static identity, which self-study is very rooted in as well. So I've been going to AERA, the self-study SIG, I've been a member, and I've been going to the Castle conference in the UK since around 2015, and it has become a main focus for my research and research agenda. So some things to know and to think about from the outset. If you have never submitted a proposal before, I think Adrian was going to put up a link to the call for submissions. That date is July 22nd, that deadline. So please review that call. And you don't have to be a member of the self-study SIG to submit a proposal to the self-study. Although we do encourage membership, it helps us develop a dynamic and strong SIG and community. This webinar is focused on proposals for paper and roundtable submissions. Currently, we are not able to have poster submissions, so we're really looking at the paper and the roundtable submissions. And as I stated before, July 22nd is the due date. And please consider for the future volunteering as a reviewer for proposal submissions. It is the best education for yourself to read others' proposals through a reviewer's lens and to be able to act as like a critical friend for somebody to give feedback and to really make those judgments about these proposals. It is a great experience, and it just really helps out everybody.
And I'll just echo Tammy's comments. The self-study SIG is a great scholarly community, so please join our SIG. It's really a dynamic space with wonderful teacher educators and scholars from around the world.
I think as far as teacher education goes, the self-study SIG has just become my academic home, and I just can't say enough about what it's done for me as a researcher and a scholar, actually. Yeah. So some things to think about when you are submitting a proposal are these 6 major elements: your objective or purpose, your perspective or framework, the methods, data sources and evidence, and results and conclusions, and the scholarly significance. That is the broad focus for AERA proposals. For the self-study SIG, though, it's really important to understand if the proposal reports on a self-study. And because self-study draws from a number of theories and frameworks and disciplines in order to create this notion of self-study, we have also added some works by Lebowski's chapter from the self-study handbook, and from Mene and Russell, I think, too, in there, Adrian, that really puts forth what it means to be a self-study. So we encourage people to read and really understand what a self-study is as opposed to other types of methodologies. And Adrian is now going to focus on what the purpose and function of each one of these 6 elements are and frame it around this self-study idea.
So we're gonna take a kind of a deep dive, take a look at these different elements or components, and really think about what is the function of each of these in the proposal, and what are some points of consideration that authors should keep in mind when creating or writing their proposals. As Tammy mentioned, there are some seminal self-study articles, the Lebowski chapter certainly, the article by Mene and Russell, and we've also shared the call for papers. So in the chat box, there should be under the first item in the chat box a link to a Dropbox folder. It has those, a link to a folder where you can access those. You can download them, you can review them and read them at your leisure. But we're going to take a look now at these 6 elements, and I think it's useful to think about these kind of like a connect the dots, right? So we think of a child's coloring book or a child's workbook, and a child uses a crayon to connect the dots, and when all of the dots are connected, a picture or an image surfaces or is recognizable, right? We can think about writing a proposal and attending to these areas as a connect the dots. The clearer they are, the more logical the internal structure is, the more logical the connections are between each of these components, the greater the clarity and the easier it is for a reviewer or for the reader to make meaning and to understand what it is that the author is seeking to communicate and convey. So we'll start off with the first element, which is the objectives or the purpose of the study, right? And so in this section, really what the author is doing is you're looking to introduce the reader, you're looking to familiarize the reader with your inquiry, with the topic or the issue under discussion, with the problem of practice that's being investigated or that's being looked at. As the author, you are the expert in the particular issue or the area that you're investigating. You know the protocol or the methods that you've gone through in order to conduct your study. The objective is really that introduction, that welcoming in of someone else to share with them and impart with them insight on what you're doing and why. And part of this is facilitated by providing a statement of the problem, right? What is the research problem? What is the issue that is being looked at or attended to or investigated in this inquiry, right? And why is it that this issue or this problem of practice merits scholarly attention, right? Why is it important? So authors may want to seek to communicate that in their objectives or purposes section. Connected to this is how the inquiry, how the self-study that is being conducted fits into the larger literature. How does this self-study, how does this research study fit in with other pieces of scholarship, other studies in the same area? So for example, if I were conducting a self-study and teaching a social studies methods course to undergraduate students where I focus on topic Y, I may want to cite and include and demonstrate what others have already learned and commented on in reference to that topic. And then I can shed light on how my inquiry or my work or what I'm proposing, what is the gap in the literature that it's seeking to fill, right? So in communicating and in discussing relevant literature, it's really a way of demonstrating a command of the literature, an understanding of what's been done, and how your study, how your research project is building on what's already been done. So it's important, again, to situate it within the larger literature, and especially in relation to self-study literature, to situate it within the self-study literature. What have other self-study researchers done or learned in reference to this area? So the objective and the purpose section also in relation to the self-study should attend to relevant features of the context, right? Relevant aspects of the researcher's positionality. As self-study researchers, we report on our experiences in our classrooms, in our institutions, in our work with our students, attentive to who we are, attentive to our experiences as embodied and embedded individuals, how our particular positionalities shapes, influences, mitigates, or lends insight on that which we are seeking to learn about. So it's important to keep that in mind, that aspect of the self, in relation to the discussion of the inquiry or of the study. And certainly, it always helps the reader, I think it always helps the reviewer to always have a clear purpose for the inquiry, a clear purpose for the study, and or research questions, right? So that when the reader begins to read the proposal, the reader knows, okay, this is the purpose, or these are the research questions, and keeps that in mind and is aware of that as they move forward, that eventually there's going to be some kind of an answer to those research questions, or there's going to be some kind of a insight or illumination relevant to what the stated purpose was.
Adrian, as you move ahead to the next section,
Yes.
Could you refresh the link to the articles? It seems to be a little bit hard to find.
Okay, I can do that when we near the ends, because I can't move out of the screen share view to access that box right now. Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah,
as Adrian goes to the next slide, the challenge of completing each of these elements is the 2,000 word limit for proposals. So one of the questions that was most frequently asked was about how long should each section be? And we suggest that each section needs to be as long as it needs to be, but in a balanced way. So you can start thinking between 350 to 400 words per section to kind of even that out, but some sections might be longer and you might have to shorten others. So each of these sections needs to be quite concise and quite limited in how you write about each one of these.
Yes, and so it's really that was a question that came up a lot, and as Tammy indicated, there is no magic foolproof answer to that. It really is contingent on your inquiry, it's contingent on your study, and how you can best communicate and convey the salience and the importance for each of these different areas, to communicate that to reviewer. But yes, those the 2,000 word limit does not include references and does not include tables or figures. So that's something worthwhile to keep in mind. Yeah. So the next section that AERA requires is a perspective or theoretical framework section. And the theoretical framework section really articulates and communicates to the reader how did the researcher think about their inquiry, think about their problem of practice? What was the frame that the author used to make meaning of their work? So when discussing a theoretical framework or conceptual lens, it's important to communicate and to define what are the main concepts or elements of that framework, right? Sometimes an individual might assume, well, I'm familiar with this framework, I'm familiar with critical theory, I'm familiar with posthumanism, and provides a statement on it. Not all researchers may be as familiar. Not all readers may be as familiar with the main concepts or the elements of those frameworks. So it's always a good idea to communicate the main elements, to define what are the main concepts in the framework that you're choosing to use, and to clarify the relevance and the appropriateness of the framework that you selected for the inquiry that you are conducting, right? So why is it that this particular framework is appropriate, or what affordances does this framework lend towards the self-study or the investigation that you're conducting. In the theoretical framework section, you may highlight related literature, other studies that have also employed the theoretical framework that you're using. Certainly consider a discussion on other self-study literature that has also employed that theoretical framework as well. So if I were using critical posthumanism in my self-study, I may say, okay, I'm going to look at research that Tammy has conducted and gain some insight on work that she's done that has drawn from critical posthumanism, or Katie Strom or others. So again, that theoretical framework, that conceptual framework, it's shedding light on how you're thinking about how are you making meaning, how are you creating meaning, deriving meaning from the work that you're engaged in. So our next section, then we move to our methods, techniques, or modes of inquiry, right? Really are the methodology section. And so this section really answers the question, well, what did you do, right? How was the research endeavor conducted? It's an explanation of what the methodological protocol was. What did you do? What was the protocol undertaken in this inquiry? And it's worthwhile and it's important to situate the inquiry in the field of self-study and to articulate how the elements of self-study were attended to in the methodological design. So as Tammy mentioned earlier, self-study draws from multiple methodologies, methods. Self-study researchers employ diverse methods, but there are certain commonalities, and those commonalities are what serve to distinguish self-study research from other forms of intimate research or intimate methodologies. The methods section should justify why were the methods that were employed appropriate for addressing the purpose of the study and or the research questions, right? So again, we think about that connecting the dots that was mentioned earlier. So this is, again, connecting those dots, connecting your research purpose, your research questions, now connecting that with the methods that you employed. A methods section sheds light on how was analysis conducted, right? How was data analysis conducted? What did you do? What was the protocol for identifying the findings or the emergent themes, right? How did these surface from the self-study research? And it's also important to acknowledge if there are any ethical considerations and trustworthiness. So if it's a research study, if it's a self-study that's being conducted with one's students that are currently in one's classroom, what were the ethical considerations? How were those attended to? And trustworthiness. Why should other authors and researchers take up what you're suggesting or what you're putting forward?
And Lebowski offers a framework for trustworthiness. So that is a great chapter to study, and we often cite that as our trustworthiness framework.
So our next section is really, Our next section is really connected to our methods section, the data sources, evidence, objects, or materials. So here you may address what were the data sources that you employed in your self-study or that you used. Was it a researcher journal? Was it student work? Was it transcripts from interviews, observations, photographs, whatever it might be. And again, we're thinking about connecting those dots. Why are those data sources that you use, that you collected, why are they appropriate or productive in order to answer your research questions and or in order to address the purpose of your inquiry? And this section may also be a space to comment on any other instruments or tools that were employed in the self-study. So some researchers may use certain computer software programs, maybe something like NVivo, or digital storage like Dropbox or Google Drive, to shed some light on that. And so now we move on to the results section. Whoops. The results or substantiated conclusions. So you're reporting on the findings. What did you learn? What surfaced from analysis, right? What are the emergent themes of your self-study? It's important to keep in mind that the findings and emergent themes should address the research purpose and should answer the research questions, right? So again, connecting the dots, going back to the beginning, the objectives, situating your study, what were your research questions? Now you conducted this self-study, you conducted this inquiry. What did you learn? What did you find out? So the findings section should discuss what are the findings, what are the emergent themes, and should discuss them with evidence to support the provided claim, right? So what evidence, what descriptions can you provide? Is it an excerpt? Is it a quote, whatever it might be, to back up and to be transparent and to showcase to the reader, to showcase to the reviewer why they should take up what you're putting forward, what you're suggesting. Your results section should also connect your findings with the theoretical framework, with the conceptual framework or lens that you're using. Again, connecting the dots. How did this theory, how did these concepts or this framework that you employed, how do you understand or make meaning of the findings through that framework, through that lens? How does that lens illuminate or further clarify or further problematize, right, the findings that you're putting forward and what you're seeking to discuss and to offer to the scholarly community as a contribution? And your results section should also comment on how do these findings now contribute or address that gap in the literature or what was previously unknown. What insight is it now supporting or putting forward? And the final section is the scientific or scholarly significance of your work, of your self-study. So an explanation of the contribution that your inquiry provides to self-study research and to teacher education, right? What is it offering? Or perhaps articulate the efficacy of your findings or your emergent themes for self-study researchers or for other teacher educators. What can they do? What takeaways can you offer, your findings offer for them and for their work? It's also always meaningful to think about what are the recommendations for future inquiry or for future research from your self-study, from the work that you've done. And it's always worthwhile, I think, when generating or writing a proposal, to comment on why would this inquiry be of interest to members of the SIG? Why would this inquiry be of interest and be appealing to members of the self-study community? And certainly, if applicable, offer some comments on how the inquiry is related to the AERA annual meeting theme.
So there are some common errors or mistakes, though, that some people make when they submit a proposal. One of the most common is that the author information isn't removed. So please make sure that you've removed all the identifying information, including any self-citing. So if you've published previously in some way, make sure that you cite just as author and also do that in the references. The word parameters are real. So that 2,000 words is a limit that AERA stands by. So please try to even scoot a little bit under that word limit. My PhD advisor always said, everything that can go in a table, put in a table, because they don't count toward the word limit. And that is really important to get some of the, especially your findings and perhaps your information about participants, things like that can go in tables. Please attend to each of the required elements. One of the first things I do when I write a proposal is kind of just block off those elements with a major headline so that I don't skip any of those elements. So each one is addressed. And submit it to the correct SIG or division. So we're the self-study SIG. You can find us when you go through the AERA website. Don't submit a proposal to more than one SIG or division. That is something that AERA doesn't allow. Another thing that we want to be clear on is that proposals are for studies that have already been conducted or completed. In order to address scholarly significance, report on findings, these can't be proposals of studies. These are studies that have been completed, and this is a proposal to present. And that's kind of the difference. And that this work is original for this particular conference, that you haven't published this anywhere yet, that this is the first time that you're presenting this work.
So some questions that are worthwhile to ask oneself or to ask yourself as you're working on your proposal and as you're going through the process, thinking about these different sections and thinking about how do I want to make sure that I communicate and convey the significance or the importance of my work, and kind of cross your T's and dot the I's. To echo some of what Tammy mentioned, did I remove all author information from the proposal, right? In the text of the proposal itself, in the reference list, did I address all of the components required for AERA proposals? Am I making sure that I'm situating my inquiry in the self-study literature? Does the proposal explain how my research employs self-study methodology? Do I provide evidence for the claims I make in my findings and in my emergent themes? Again, connecting the dots. Do I connect my findings and emergent themes with the theoretical framework or with the conceptual framework or lens? Do I explain how my self-study contributes to the STEP literature? Did you include your reference list? Did I include a reference list? Did I include any relevant tables or figures? Did I proofread my work? Very important. Make sure that you proofread your work, run spell check, check for grammar. If you have a critical friend that can take a look at your work, approach your critical friend and say, here, please take a look at this proposal. I want to send it out and make sure it's okay. Always worth doing. There were some questions when folks registered about the number of authors. Proposals can be authored by one individual, can be authored by more than one individual. It's up to you. It's based on your inquiry and what you're doing. Yeah.
If you have, oh, sorry, go ahead, Adrian.
No.
I would say if you have questions in the chat, I've been kind of addressing questions as they've come up and kind of keeping track. But if you have further questions, please add them in the chat and I'll keep addressing them here.
So I think now we'll shift. We'll take some time to look at questions or answer questions that you may have. Before we do so, we do want to announce there is an upcoming webinar with Anastasia Samaras and Mikey Lunenberg, which will be moderated by Laura Kennedy on July 7th at 2020 at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, introducing self-study research. I highly recommend attending the webinar. I know I'll be there. And in the chat box, if you go, it should be there. If you go to the beginning of the chat, I included a link there that you can access to register for the upcoming webinar. So we'll take this time now for questions.
So Amanda just asked a really good question about, is it okay to have multiple methods? For example, self-study and fiction-based research, or self-study and narrative inquiry? Yes, we do that all the time. That is a very common, to couple self-study with another method is a very common way to conduct self-study research.
Yes.
Can you talk to me more about what you mean by findings or emergent themes? Are those different? What would you suggest? Can you suggest that studies include findings versus emergent themes?
I don't think I would suggest using one term or framing it one way over the other. I believe, or my understanding would be that the term findings perhaps emerged from traditional quantitative research, whereas framing what is learned as emergent themes surface more out of the qualitative tradition or qualitative methodology. So it's really up to the researcher and their inquiry and how the self-study researcher is thinking about their work to think about the language and which of those terms best expresses or encapsulates what they're doing and the relevance of what they're learning and what they're finding out.
Mm-hmm. I often use the word results as well, rather than findings, that these were the results of my study, and then I express them as emergent themes. Are there any other questions that we haven't addressed? Somebody earlier asked a question about doctoral students becoming reviewers. And yes, that is encouraged. We have a section for graduate students to act as reviewers, and it is a wonderful way to educate yourself about writing proposals and a wonderful way to connect and network with the self-study community. And she was wondering also at what point should doctoral students become reviewers? And I would say at whatever point you feel comfortable, give it a try.
I would recommend, as soon as you start your doctoral studies, join the SIG and volunteer to serve as a reviewer earlier on in your studies, in your doctoral education. It will support you and provide insight early in your PhD studies on what others are doing in the field, how others are communicating and expressing their ideas, and what's happening, what's going on. So absolutely worth doing.
Should tables be placed? Is there a limit on the tables and figures, and should they be placed as they would be in the paper or at the end of a proposal?
I believe that normally the tables would be placed after the reference sections, not within the body of the proposal.
Yes, I agree.
That's the usual format.
And how about the word limit on the AERA paper itself? I'm not sure what that is. Is that?
So it's 2,000 words. That does not include the references or the tables or figures that might be included.
But the paper after the proposal, if a proposal is accepted.
So for some sessions, it is requested that the presenters turn in a paper. There are no defined page limits or page lengths on that. Normally what would happen is if a proposal is accepted and it's going to be shared in a paper session or in a symposia, normally the chair for that session will reach out to the presenters and establish dates by when they would need to submit the full paper so that it could be shared with the discussant for that session. And so I'm noticing, I believe Laura, thank you. Mm-hmm. Laura just shared the link for the upcoming webinar. So that should be available for everyone. And
another good question is adding multimedia to proposals. So I guess, or to the presentation after acceptance. I think AERA, so much is up in the air right now with whether this is going to be, you know, how this upcoming conference is going to look. But I think of all SIGs, self-study is one of the most experimental in how things are presented and most accepting. So I think a multimedia would be more than welcome as part of the presentation, especially if we're going virtual. And if a proposal is under review currently by a journal, could it be submitted to AERA? I'm not sure what the parameters are around that, Adrian.
I believe that if there's a work that is under review, if it is accepted by AERA, if the work is published before the conference, the work is not eligible for inclusion. I would encourage everyone to take a look at that, the call for proposals, because they do include quite a bit of information on more of those technical situations that could come up. But once the work is published and it's shared, it's not eligible, but per AERA rules, for inclusion in the program.
I see Adrian has posted the articles folder as well. The link to the articles folder is now in the chat. And as far as the paper or roundtable, do we get to select the option? Unfortunately, you get to select paper or roundtable, and then as proposals come in, the program chairs are given parameters by AERA as to how many sessions, how many people per session, what should these sessions look like for kind of the best conference, and then we get to decide whether this will be a paper or roundtable. And is there a place you can see samples of previous proposals?
I believe that AERA used to have, I'm not sure if it's still there anymore, you may have to kind of dig around the website, but there were sample proposals that were publicly available on their website previously. So it might be worthwhile to go to their website and take a look and see what's available or what's been shared. You know,
as far as steeping yourself and immersing yourself in self-study methodology, self-study seminal work, self-study practice, I would encourage you just to go to the S-STEP journal and read multiple S-STEP articles that are published in that journal. It will really give you a good feel for what self-study methodology looks like when it's published, and it will help you structure your proposal.
Go to the journal, Studying Teacher Education.
Yes.
Springer has a great series of self-study scholarship. There's also the handbook, the first edition, certainly. We're quite excited. The second edition of that handbook is being released right around now, I believe, at this time. So those are all great places to go, great sources to really immerse yourself, read up about the theory, the methodology, the approaches that others have taken. And just to kind of echo a bit more what Tammy was mentioning, when you submit you have the option, you will decide the formats in which you would want your work to be considered for presentation. So our SIG doesn't have poster sessions, but other divisions or SIGs do. So then you would check off all the different formats in which you would want your work to be considered for presentation. But then, as indicated, program chairs make decisions and determine how to structure the annual program.
I see Laura has posted a link to some proposals in the chat, so that will be very helpful. Link, also Teresa has mentioned that Link, which is an online journal, volume 4, issue 1, is focused on self-study. So that is also another place to go and learn more about this methodology and to see how it's written, how it's conducted, what the vernacular is, what are the seminal works.
So Tammy, I'm not sure if you mentioned this. Somebody had asked about ID information removed from document properties.
Yes.
I think that means that even if you're working in a Microsoft Word document and you don't include your name in the document, in the file itself, usually it's a tab. When one looks at the properties of the file, the properties tab, in the properties tab, it may have the name of the person to whom that version of Microsoft Office was registered to, which is likely the author of whoever created that Microsoft Word document. I believe that normally when proposals are submitted, they're converted to a PDF. And
yes.
So that information would not remain or would be accessible to the reviewer.
If you have further questions, I think we have our, yeah, we do. We have our contact information. Please feel free to email us with questions. And we have our upcoming webinar that Adrian's already told you about. But we also have a series of more webinars following that. So we're really trying to promote self-study, and we're really trying to scaffold the writing of these proposals and these papers as we look forward to 2021 in Orlando.
Yes. So we look forward to 2021, and we certainly look forward and hope that we can all see each other in person. Our understanding is that our AERA 2021 will happen virtually or in person. So it is taking place. It will occur. So thank you for joining us. We hope you found this productive. We hope you found this useful. Please join the SIG. Please consider submitting a proposal, send a proposal for next year's annual meeting. Enjoy the rest of the day or your evening, and be well.
Thank you, everybody. And I can't wait to see everyone in Orlando, either virtually or face-to-face. We'll see what happens.
Yes.